let me clear up one thing. As we go into that discussion about my work with the Abyssinian Development Corporation and what inspired me to get involved in that work, I want to just clear up one thing. I'm not a fan of corporal punishment. I'm not a fan of it. I think it has its place in the right setting, but too often people abuse the right that they have to discipline their children in that way. So I want to make clear, because I don't want the opponents of domestic or the opponents of domestic violence to think somehow I've crossed the line, because too many children, men and women, are abused by violence. However, I do think that it may have its place in some cases, but strong discipline is more of what I was reaching for. Now,
would it be fair just to say in a nutshell, basically, you believe in discipline but not abuse?
well, I believe in strong discipline. I'll put it that way. I certainly do not believe in abuse. I do not believe in abuse, and I think that I didn't want anybody to take my statement about getting a spanking as saying, well, the Reverend says he gives us a license to go off and beat our kids. No, I'm not. I'm just saying that strong discipline has its place. But moreover, I come from not only my upbringing in the confines of Morehouse College and Dr. Mays, but I'm also the recipient of a legacy in Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. And I understood Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. as arguing for not integration, but desegregation. And that's a difference. I believe that people ought to be able to live wherever they want to and can afford to. Because in the civil rights movement, in the movement for equal rights in this country, we were saying, if I want to live, hence A Raisin in the Sun, that great play by Lorraine Hansberry, if I want to live in a community where the lawns are manicured and the houses look good and I think the schools are better, I ought to have a right to live there. And I should not be denied because of the color of my skin. And so therefore, it would be wrong of me to keep anybody out of a neighborhood because of the color of their skin. What drives gentrification is more the greed that is a part of the culture of America. You know, materialism is the unconscious missionary faith of the West. And so some of the gentry, a small percentage, but some of the gentry is not white. It is very black. And I can show you that in Harlem. But the real thing that drives the developers and causes them to come into our community as they turn around the property is the money that they can make. They wouldn't care who bought the property as long as they bought the property at their price. Let me give an example. When I arrived at Abyssinian in 1972, we began to move around the community. I was very active in the community, very much on the streets. And the one thing I noticed over and over again, there was a steady deterioration of the housing. And as I watched it more and more, I saw that across a few years, the city of New York was becoming the major landlord because it was taking property where taxes had not been paid and where critical maintenance had not been done, and the landlords were not to be found. So the city was bringing the property into itself. It was called in-rim property. And the city was a poor landlord and just didn't do a good job. And more of the buildings were being abandoned. Well, in Harlem, where there are large numbers of African American people, in fact, those buildings were deteriorating at such a rapid rate, the city of New York was the biggest landlord in New York. And as we watched that, we said no. And then upon further investigation, we learned from our city council person, Fred Samuel, and others, that there was a plan behind all of this. I was 22, 23 years old. There was a plan behind all of this. And what we discovered in the plan was that the city would gain more and more of this property, but the landlords who were absent, who had abandoned the property, were planning to come back in, and just for the taxes, not for the value of the property, just for the taxes, those landlords were going to merge, come together, buy the property from the city at a fraction of what it was worth. That would destroy rent control and any privilege or right that the tenants had, and they would be able to then own the property. They'd cut out rent control, develop it for a market that was beyond anyone who had lived there, particularly senior citizens. And so we said no. We put up a fight. And fortunately, through the efforts of Fred Samuel and our own efforts as some of the clergy coming together, I was in the leadership of that, we won the battle. In other words, no private developer could come into Harlem and get those buildings without a community-based organization being involved. And the community-based organization was given the right to buy those buildings at $1 a piece. Well, the Abyssinian Development Corporation bought the buildings at $1 a piece and other properties in Harlem. And we were able to develop them with private developers into affordable housing. And so we became the strongest not-for-profit developer of affordable housing in Harlem, with more than 2,000 units of affordable housing. We built schools because we understood community development. We also encouraged private development at a reasonable level, because you can build no community with just one level of income. You have to have some poor folk, you have to have some middle income folk, and you have to have some folk who are doing very well. Hence, your review of the janitor and the doctor living on the same block. But that presented role models in the community, people who would fight for better schools, that cleans up crime, and that's what gave rise to the Development Corporation. Now, once we did that, of course, then the white people who had fled from Harlem decades before, and then the whites who were living in places like Westchester County, out here on Long Island, northern Jersey, who were suffering because of tolls, energy costs, brutal transportation in and out of the city, said, hey, why can't we live in Harlem? And that's when the private developers came back in, and with the help of the some administrations, Bloomberg and others, began to compete with the not-for-profits. Now, if you want to go back and look at the history, they hit us hard. They accused us of stealing money, conspiring against them, all lies, all lies. And so we're still here, but we're battling against well-financed, well-lawyered private developers whose major interest is money. So if I had enough black folk who were interested in coming back in Harlem and paying those kinds of prices to come back, it wouldn't matter what color the gentry is. And so we are in a vicious fight, not only in Harlem, in Norfolk, Virginia, in San Francisco, California, in Houston, anywhere black people have controlled valuable property for years. You're going to find this gentry trying to get back in, and developers wanting to take advantage of that influx of dollars. It's complicated, it's difficult, but it is the result of desegregation. When we're not segregated, when we learn to get in and how to develop property to our advantage, then you see a backlash it's almost like the Trump backlash on Obama. Well, you can't let black folk get any power in this country. Don't you dare. And so that's what we're dealing with. And Adam Powell saw that even more clearly than Martin Luther King Jr. He said it's not so much about wanting to be in business with you or wanting to live in your neighborhoods. It's just really about making the opportunity available to us, giving us the opportunity to make sure that the resources are distributed equitably. So it's not so much that I want to integrate with you, it's just that I don't want any barriers blocking me from getting into the things that I want to get into, or money coming into my school system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.